He's from the Netherlands. He's actually, I learned last night, you were born in a houseboat in Amsterdam. I don't know what's more Amsterdam than that. He used to be a high school teacher and taught philosophy. Quite the change to back into development.
Yep.
I actually met Martin at the Cordova face-to-face at Microsoft that we had last year, and he was working on the METEOR Cordova integration. And now he started to explore a bit more about React Native and Cordova. So that's what his talk is about, and I'll let him take it from here.
Thank you very much. Thanks. All right. As Steve mentioned, I work at METEOR Development Group, based in San Francisco. I live here in Amsterdam still. I work remotely. And I had originally planned a talk on some of the on the Cordova integration in METEOR and some of the improvements we've made in METEOR 1.3. But I actually thought a sort of more forward-looking and speculative talk would be more interesting and generate a conversation maybe. And the main idea behind this talk is that Cordova and React Native actually have a lot in common. In terms of their goals, in terms of the developers they're targeting, in terms of the use cases they are most suitable for. But before going into the topic of Cordova and React Native, out of curiosity, I would like to ask sort of how many of you have heard of METEOR, the METEOR framework? Yeah, quite a few still. How many of you have actually used it in a project? Not that many here. So this is really sort of the 15-second summary. So METEOR is a full-stack JavaScript framework. Code in METEOR runs both on the server and on the client. We started about 4 years ago. The most distinguishing feature is the data stack, which actually sort of crosses the client-server divide, bridges the client-server divide. You subscribe to data on the server, and it's automatically transferred to a client-side cache where you can reactively wire up your data to your UI. METEOR supports multiple view layers, including React and Angular, and it has had a mobile integration for the last 2 years, which is based on Cordova. And that's what I have been working on for, well, until January, sort of a 6-month period. And I think the thing I'm most proud of in the new METEOR 1.3 version is improved hot code push. So I wrote plugins in Swift and Java that do very efficient and safe hot code push. So they only download changed assets, individual files that have changed. It detects faulty JavaScript. So it will never sort of block your app. It will always revert to the last known good version. It also has some safety measures where it actually blocks updates when plugins have changed or the platform has changed. So I feel we have a fairly good Cordova integration right now. But to be sort of entirely honest, I'm originally a native developer. I had been doing mostly iOS development. And when I first started working at METEOR, I had actually worked on a METEOR iOS framework. That was one of the reasons I was hired. And when it turned out I had to work on the Cordova integration, my first question was, why Cordova? And I think that's a fairly common response from native developers. Sort of when you're used to native development, the flexibility it gives you, it's really hard to go back to an architecture where you don't have access to sort of all the device features and all the native UI elements. But I've started to appreciate Cordova. I've talked to a lot of our customers, and as I assume you all know, the great thing about Cordova is really it's not really about the technology, but it's about what kind of developers it allows you to work on projects. It allows you to sort of not split up your development into technology teams. You don't need to hire iOS developers or Android developers if you can find them. It really allows you to develop apps using a common skill set. Because web development is a skill set that is sort of much more widely available than, let's say, iOS or Android development. So learn once, write anywhere, I think is a very appropriate way of putting it. This is actually something the React Native guys like to use. And note that it's different from write once, run anywhere. Because I think that's not what Cordova gives you. It's something that web development might give you, but technologies like responsive design are for websites. They're not for apps. I don't think you can get away with a single code base for desktop, web, and mobile apps and still call it an app. It works fine for websites. You may be able to put them in a native wrapper, but if you want to develop native apps that really blend in with the platform, you'll need a mobile UI framework. You'll need something like Ionic or Onsen or Framework 7 or maybe even something you build yourself. And once you start bringing in these frameworks, it's more than web development. What you're really doing is thinking in terms of components, components these frameworks give you. And one of the most exciting developments to me over the last couple of years is the emergence of frameworks like React and Angular, especially Angular 2, which gives you a very nice composable user interface model. And what's interesting about these models is that they're really changing what we mean when we talk about web development. So composable user interfaces, that suggests we're sort of putting parts together. But what are the parts? Like in traditional web development, you're using HTML. You know what the elements are that you can use. In frameworks like React and Angular, you really raise the level of abstraction. You're no longer thinking in terms of HTML elements, but you're thinking in terms of higher level components, declarative components that are often application specific. So you really decompose your views into meaningful components that are self-contained. And to give just sort of one code example, how many of you here are familiar with React? Okay, a couple. What you see here is a React component defined as a JavaScript class, and you write sort of instead of a separate template language, you use a sort of embedded language, JSX, to sort of define your component tree. But if you look at this component tree, and this could represent, for instance, a story in a Facebook-like newsfeed, there's a top-level card component here. It contains a profile picture component, a comment list component, and then there's the span. So the span is a standard HTML element. All the other components are application-specific. They're much more high level. And what that means is that you get to think in terms of these higher level components. The fact that some components are implemented as, let's say, an HTML div or an HTML image tag or a certain CSS style is an implementation detail. So when you expand a tree like this, you end up with an HTML tree, and that's what gets rendered. But the framework itself, React itself, is completely independent of the DOM. It's not actually tied to the DOM in any way. You can render to DOM elements. You could also render to a canvas. And I think this is the interesting situation, you can also render to native. And that's what React Native gives you. So sort of the goal of React Native is to bring modern web techniques to mobile. So to take that skill set, the web developer skill set, and take that to an architecture that allows you to render to native. So where Cordova, of course, gives you a web view, and you write your views using HTML and CSS, and the native part consists of the plugins. So that's non-UI code that allows you to access device native features. React Native also contains a JavaScript runtime, but not a web view. So your application code is still written in JavaScript, which also means that it's not tied to a specific platform. You're not writing it using Swift or Java. But your native UI components are native views. They're Android views or iOS views, or as recently announced, there's now also Windows Universal support for React Native. So you can target these different platforms and actually build up views out of native elements using your JavaScript code. And the React model, I don't really have time to go into this right now, but it's a very interesting and performant model. It's completely declarative. It makes sure to only send sort of what changed between frames over the bridge in batches. So it's a very efficient model. It actually avoids many of the problems, for instance, Bruce just mentioned, that happen when you, for instance, modify layout attributes imperatively and have to deal with things like reflow. That's something that could never happen with a model like this. So this is sort of the most famous example of a React Native app, the first major app Facebook wrote using React Native. It's the Ads Manager. And this is the iOS version. And then the same team that wrote the iOS version wrote an Android version. And there's 85% code reuse, which is a lot, but may also be less than you would expect. That 15%, however, is really very relevant. If you take a close look at sort of the differences between these apps, those differences are what make them blend in with the platform. So there's a tab bar in the iOS case, and in the Android case, there's a floating action button. So these are all sort of the platform-specific elements that really make them blend in with the platform. So what does a React Native view tree look like? Well, very similar to a React Web view tree. You're still sort of defining your app in terms of these higher level components. The only difference is that the primitives you end up with are not DOM elements, they're not divs or spans or images. No, in this case, they're views and texts and images. So there's actually a lot of reuse possible between React Web and React Native. In many cases, the higher level components can be reused as is. The difference is in the primitives. And there's even a project, which I think is really interesting, called React Native for Web, that exposes the exact same primitives, like view and text, to your web app. So in that case, you could reuse, you could define your components in terms of these primitives instead of DOM primitives and achieve even more reusability. So React Native gives you access to native UI components, but it also has a plugin-like system, like Cordova. And I think that's one of the areas where Cordova really has the upper hand. The plugin ecosystem is huge, and the React Native plugin ecosystem is just getting started. So one of the interesting projects I thought And this is by, and I hope I pronounce his name correctly, Badashuran from Microsoft. And he wrote sort of a proof of concept, a React Native Cordova plugin adapter that allows you to use Cordova plugins from React Native. So that's, I think, a really nice integration point. I don't think there's any reason for sort of separate plugin ecosystems. It would be really nice if the React Native and Cordova communities could work together on a common set of plugins. I think Cordova clearly has sort of the largest collection of plugins. React Native has some really nice features in their JavaScript native bridge, including support for asynchronous calls and promises that maybe Cordova could learn from. So this is something that I think would be a nice sort of point of contact. Another interesting project, sort of a side project, also from Microsoft, is Project ACE. Some of you may have heard of it, which allows you to sort of mix web views and native views. And this is mostly used for sort of using native navigation with web views. And this Project ACE uses sort of a custom way of defining these native elements. But I think the general model would be really nice to get something working with React Native, where you could define a common React component tree and have some parts render to native and some parts render to web. And this is a model that I've been experimenting with, and I'm actually giving a sort of more in-depth talk about that in 2 weeks at React Europe. So that will be a more technical talk. For now, I'm not sure if we have time for questions, but I hope this generates some conversation. Come talk to me if you think this sounds interesting or you have questions or suggestions. Sure.
I think we have time for one question. Anyone want to ask a question? Hands up. Quiet crowd. All right.
Oh, yeah.
The first question is how?
How?
It's a little question, but a huge response, I think.
I mean, the nice thing about React is that it really separates, and this is true of Angular as well, it really separates sort of your application code and the component tree and the renderer. So React Native, for instance, has a debugging model where actually your code runs on your machine in Chrome, but it renders to your device. And that same sort of remote rendering mechanism could be used to render to a web view.
Thank you.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
All right.